My name's Elizabeth Heald, and I'm the President and CEO of the Kitchener-Waterloo Community Foundation. I'm so pleased to be joined today by one of KWCF's board members, Andrea Harding, who I will introduce in a moment. And throughout the next hour, you'll hear from 6 Black and Indigenous leaders in our community around important topics that are prevalent today. These speakers include Ruth Cameron, Ciann Wilson, Fitsum Areguy, Laurier Campbell, Donna Dubie, and Amy Smoke. As I mentioned, in the essence of time, we have been sharing their bios in the chat function, so please take a look to learn more about these incredible leaders. This is not a presentation. It's a conversation with people with lived experiences sharing their stories. We encourage you and thank you for taking the time to educate yourselves. And on that topic of educating yourselves, most of you will have received an email yesterday with a link to a video series by Kike Ojo called Challenging Systemic Barriers. Over the last year, the team at KWCF has been using these tools as prompts for some open, authentic conversations about very important topics like racism. We will be sharing a link to the videos in the chat later today. If you have other resources that you want to share that would be useful in our collective quest to educate ourselves, please feel free to share using the chat function. One last comment before I invite our guests to join. I heard this quote on the radio over the weekend and I wanted to share it with you today. Treat racism like COVID-19. Assume you have it, listen to experts about it, don't spread it, and be willing to change your life to end it. So thank you for joining us over the next hour and for your willingness to learn and be a part of the change that's critically needed. I would now like to invite Andrea Harding and our guests to join us.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Before we get started, we acknowledge that the land on which the speakers gathered today is the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral people. We acknowledge the enduring presence of the Indigenous people with whom we share this land today, their achievements and their contributions to our community. We offer this acknowledgement as an act of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples of Canada. As we are virtual, you may be joining us from another territory today, and if so, I encourage you to do some research to find more about the land you live, work, and play on. As a settler, it is my responsibility to understand what truth and reconciliation means and my part in it. It is a constant process of learning and unlearning that I take responsibility for on a daily basis through reading, reflection, research, and participating in conversations such as our dialogue today. I take this responsibility very seriously, and I'm calling on my fellow settlers to do the same. Thank you for joining us today as part of your learning. Before we start with the questions, I wanted to give Donna an opportunity to share some reflections.
Good afternoon. Hello, Sego, Spinagola, Ani. Welcome to this opportunity for us to share our thoughts with the community. I would like to start off with reminding the community that we have for many years tried to work with various levels of government and with the Royal Commission report and recently the Truth and Reconciliation documents and the recommendation, the 94 calls to action. I would like to use that as a forefront for our community to start off with as to recognizing some of the calls to action that the various levels of government can follow through on. And this is the time for you to follow through on those recommendations. So I would like to turn this over to somebody else at this point because unfortunately I'm having a problem with my computer and my modem is gone, so I will be cutting in and out. And I hope that I came across from beginning to end of my conversation, and let's have an awesome, truthful, respectful conversation today. Yawa.
Thanks, Donna. Luckily, your internet held up, at least on my end, and we were able to hear your message, so I appreciate it, and hopefully you can jump in a little bit throughout this. Our first question that I'm going to start off with is, why this focus on Black and Indigenous realities and experiences of systemic racism in this moment in Canada? Why is this important, and what do non-Indigenous and non-Black people need to know? I'm going to turn it over to Ruth to kick the conversation off.
Thank you, Andrea. I hope that I sound clear to everyone. I wanted to start off by thinking about Black and Indigenous current realities in Canada as being very much informed by the differences and the linkages in our history in Canada. And when I think about that as an individual, I think back to our histories as causing us to both be something I call hypervisible in Canadian history and in Canada, and also invisible in Canadian history and in Canada. And those things show up differently for our communities. I think about the fact that the history of Canada starts with a corporation, the Hudson's Bay Company. And that corporation starts with an expedition to set up a fort, clear land of its original inhabitants. And that expedition is financed with money from the Royal Africa Company, which was the corporation set up by the King of England at that time, and his brother was, we called it Rupert's Land. I think we all were taught that around grade 8 in history class. That expedition and that fort, the soldiers, and the start of the precursor to the Northwest Mounted Police in Canada, whose purpose was to clear land for exploitation, for profit. That was all financed by proceeds from the transatlantic slave trade in the Caribbean. So to me, that start of Canada, which starts with trafficking and enslavement of Africans, and clearing Indigenous people from their territories so that the land could be enclosed within a fort and taken in for profit, tells a lot about what is going on and informs what's going on with us to this very day. So now the stories that are told are that there are not many Indigenous people in Canada, right? And in that way, indigeneity is, we're told, doesn't exist, but also that there was not slavery in Canada, and that for Black Canadians, our history is very recent, when it is not. It was part of the start of Canada. So I'm going to just stop there and allow someone else to speak.
I guess I'll build on that. And thanks so much, Ruth, for that opening in terms of, starting that context. In building on that, just to sort of build on what you've talked about in terms of the fact that Canada did have enslavement, they did have enslaved African people. And so just sort of acknowledging that history and naming that outright, I think that Canada does a really great job of telling a story of being a part of the Underground Railroad. And that's the part of the story that they feel that they've whitewashed and are really proud to share, while not acknowledging their participation and continued participation in Indigenous genocide and the enslavement of African people throughout the history of the building of this nation state. If we're talking, really frankly, we have to talk about Canada as being part of the British North American Empire building project, right? And that includes the Canada, United States, and the UK. And so really, specifically naming that, I think that in the larger Canadian consciousness, again, erasure is a part of that conversation and a whitewashing of history. And so to Ruth's point, we have to acknowledge that these nation states are built on genocide, that they are built on enslavement, and acknowledging that bloodshed and acknowledging that really vicious and violent history, I think is the only way that we come to really understand the uniqueness of Indigenous erasure, the uniqueness of the fight of Indigenous people for sovereignty, and the uniqueness of anti-Black racism that persists in these nation states to the current moment, as Ruth has articulated. And so that really sheds light, I think, about the specificity of the issues that we're talking about today, the specificity of some of the violences that we still face as two peoples. And we'll talk a little bit later about some of the context within which we've built solidarity and connections out of this history, and that also being a really important part of our stories.
Just to build on all of that really, really important historical context that continually is erased. There's a local history as well, with Black people living here for a really, really long time. There's the history of Queensbush settlement that was settled by Black people for a very, very long time, and as early as 1850, and were driven out by the British, 3 decades after they had settled there. That history is always erased in the retellings of Waterloo's mythical norms, to use a phrase from Audre Lorde. We talk about Mennonite histories, we talk about German settlement histories. We do not talk enough about Indigenous histories here, and I mean deep Indigenous histories here, and we do not talk enough about Black histories. And this plays out in the current day institutions and organizations that get a lot of respect, and which translates into funding to support work that they do here. And it's just a cycle that keeps going.
Yeah. I feel really lucky that I learned a very tiny bit of the history and land connection and land significance of Victoria Park within the last week. And I was just part of a conversation that was ongoing. And I hope that I don't get any of this incorrect, but that land right there was a gathering place, but it also was a place of ceremony for marriages. And we think about the current, use of the pavilion, and people get married there. People love, it's a beautiful park, but it was a place for unions to come together for much, much longer than that. And I feel such gratitude in being able to know that about this place. But those histories that really connect to land and place and who had relationship with this land, I want to know more of that. It has to inform how we go forward together.
I think that's a really great place for Amy, if Amy, because Amy's in Victoria.
Yes.
Yes, I am, and I apologize for the amount of wind. It's pretty windy today. Ciann is correct. Yeah, this is a hub of activity between the Chinatan, the Anishinaabe, and the Haudenosaunee. Economic, trade, feasting, ceremony, kinship relations. When we brought our children here at marriable age, we developed bigger circles of kinship with the other communities. And it grew out from here. The Germans arrived and found out about this hub of activity here, all of the trading going on and all of that. And we traded with them and taught them how to live on the land here. And then they built the Joseph Schneider House just down the street. And the city built out from this place, from our little hub here. And yeah, I think it's important that people recognize that that's the reason why Kitchener exists today. And I think there's a small plaque at the front of the park that says something about it. It's unfortunate that there is not enough history about the actual economic hub and the activity that was going on here, which has been completely erased by the rest of Kitchener.
And to build on that, as far as monuments go, with the myths and the mythologies that keep getting respected and revered here, the same thing sort of goes with Schneider's factory. Schneider's factory, and the people who started that business gave a lot of people in this region work, but it also took up a lot of space. And even as it gets torn down, I live down the street from that factory. as it gets torn down, what is going to take its place, a beautiful new development called the Metz in honor of Joseph Metzger Schneider, who started the building. And so we see these things continue, and these histories, again, just get embedded, even as people know now to do land acknowledgements and to say the words. We still see monuments being put up in honor of settler colonials.
If I think even more about this history and how it gets erased, and what I originally spoke to about the start of Canada, then we see, going from this particular history lesson that we just started here, how all these things feed into our current realities here in Canada, right? So if we start out with Indigenous peoples being cleared off their land by a prototype police force, and then we see Black individuals' enslavement and trafficking being used to finance this police force, we see how we get tied into the current violence through the military, through policing in Canada, and that those forces were actually created to control us, to eliminate us when we weren't economically useful, and to make sure that we didn't get access to land so that others could profit off land, not prosper on land in relationship to it, but profit off it by keeping others away from land. So hopefully through going from A to F to Z, just like that, people can see how inextricably tied up our current realities are with paramilitary and policing violence and other systems that use the same kind of violence, what we call carceral systems of punishment, our child welfare system, sometimes our mental health system, and see how those echo that same kind of punishment and control of bodies. And then you see how this is all tied up in our really complex history, and why we in particular see each other in this violence and know that we must work together, because of our well-being and our thriving is tied to one another. Through this history, and because we are actually both recognize each other as Indigenous peoples. Black people are also Indigenous peoples, just not from here.
And thank you, Ruth. I think that ties in really nicely to the next question, which we'll have Laurier kick off. And I think I saw Ciann was ready to chat about it as well. But wondered if you could speak specifically to the call from your communities to defund the police, and why is that important to center in this moment?
All right, thank you. I apologize. I got kicked out once. If it happens again, I'm going to go on data off my phone. But hopefully I'll stay in on this. And I, thank you everybody for what you shared. I wanted to elaborate just a little bit more on when Ruth is speaking of the clearing of the plains. And, most people, I remember I grew up in Saskatchewan, and, having that glorious opportunity of going to tour the Royal Canadian Mounted Police Museum that is in Regina and F Division, and where they train. And the sanitization of history around the formation of that organization was not included in that museum. And so originally the Northwest Mounted Police were specifically created by Sir John A. Macdonald, the first Prime Minister of Canada, modeled after the Royal Irish Constabulary, which was a quasi-military group that was heavily armed and was used to basically beat down the poor Irish who were revolting. And so he very consciously was aware of the organization that he was creating, and so enlisted 200 men to go out west. And part of his reasoning was it was really expensive for the military. And so he created this other organization to go out there and to clear the plains. And by clearing of the plains, it was clearing it of the Indigenous peoples that were there, right? And so Indigenous peoples, we weren't, it wasn't the people that Canada needed. They wanted the resources and to exploit the resources. And so in Canada, right, that's how we got confined and locked up, on reservations and cleared off the plains. And part of the work that was done to do that was also, in particular out west, was the slaughter of millions of buffalo, which were our sustenance to everything from food to ceremony to clothing and shelter, and just left to die in the fields. And so that clearing occurred, but and the Northwest Mounted Police were who secured us and kept us the force, the police force. The force was against Indigenous peoples. The service is for the settler and colonizers who were coming out there, right? And that's always been the system. And on the first question, you kind of asked something sort of specific about systemic racism. And I think it's really important to think that no equity, diversity, or inclusion or reform program is going to give us the outcome of what we're looking for when there's systemic racism built within the system itself. And so we really need to think about looking outside of that. Indigenous peoples, we've always, I hear the stories from my old aunties and the stories that they've heard before and the fights that we've been doing intergenerationally, but have been many times and currently like trying to get the services, the resources that we need so that we can have the services that we need to keep us healthy and safe and to build our communities again. And, language recovery, culture recovery. We had very complex legal systems, education systems, kin systems, all of those things that we're, working on recovering that we know make us healthy. And literally, I was just listening to MPP Saul Mamakwat speaking in the House earlier this week. And, the Premier walked out as he stood up to speak, essentially standing there begging for us as Indigenous peoples to have our basic human rights met. And that absolutely rips my heart out to see how we're treated in that way. When we ask or are requesting services that are also entrenched within our treaty rights, that were agreements made, nobody responds, or very, very few people respond, I would say. Very few people respond within the positions of power to provide, to meet those agreements. When we do things like put up blockades and shut down Canada, and people get upset about the Indigenous peoples being restless, that gets us a little bit of attention for a small while. When we speak about defunding the police, when the defund the police hashtag started going out, that got a response from people. And so it's still asking, in my understanding, still asking for much of the same thing. The police have never been a service to us. They've never protected us. They have been the people who hunted us, confined us, dragged us back and onto the reserves, right? So we need the resources that we can then develop and work on our own systems and recovery of our own systems to keep ourselves healthy. Having police come in and start surveilling us or trying to take our kids out to a camp is disgusting and further breaks up those kin systems. I've shared the example before of, I'm a 60 scoop survivor. I came out here to Ontario partly to connect with one of my brothers that I had not met before because of the 60 scoop. And last summer, for the first time, my brother and I and two of his sons went camping for the first time. My brother and I are almost 50 years old. Neither of his two children live with him full time. They couldn't have gone with him if I had not been there. And, but I can tell you the benefit to my nephews and to my brother and to us as a family far outweighed any benefit that would have come from taking my two nephews and sending them off with some stranger to go have that experience. So that's just one really practical example. I'm going to leave it there and let some others jump in on that.
Go ahead, Ciann.
Great, thanks. Thanks so much, Laurie, for bringing us to that larger scope of what the RCMP have meant in the Canadian historical context as they were established in 1873, and definitely were about clearing land for white settler colonialism. We also know that the first publicly funded police in the United States were called the Slave Patrols, and they were established in the 1790s. And as their name, sort of suggests, their entire objective was to control and surveil enslaved African people and haul them back to their masters should they seek freedom, right? Seek to be free and fully functioning human beings, fully living their lives and able to live their lives. And so these are just some of the things to think about, that when we call for the defunding of police, I think a lot of people, their back gets up against the walls and there's a lot of alarm, like they can't imagine themselves outside of this white settler construct called the police, right? And when they hear this, a lot of alarms go off for people. People get really concerned, and they also don't know that history that impacts our communities, that is deeply wrought in Indigenous erasure and the annexing of Indigenous peoples off their territories, and deeply entrenched in anti-Black racism and violence, right? And so just really highlighting that history again for folks, that we often hear the words defund police or abolition, and folks are so deeply entrenched in white settlerism that they cannot for the life of them imagine and conceptualize a world without the police, even though there's much evidence to suggest that the police are not only it's not only structures of white supremacy that we're talking about that have deeply entrenched perceptions of Indigenous and Black people, but that they're causing harm. And if they're causing harm in the communities that they're harming are saying, this is not okay, this cannot continue, and we will not support the continued funding of these bodies. A part of white settlerism is that defensiveness and that protectionism and white solidarity, right, to protect these predominantly white institutions. And I want to just highlight that a lot of what I see in the media is this sort of uproar at this idea. And what I challenge folks on the line today and listening today to think about is how committed we are to white settlerism when we think that these ideas are out of the box and crazy and just not feasible or possible, despite the folks that are on the ground that are feeling those harms saying we must, because it's harmful, because it's violent, and that violence is historically entrenched in our intergenerational trauma and our intergenerational memories as peoples. And so I just want to highlight that piece for folks who are listening today.
And thinking about where we find ourselves presently, and the greater knowledge in the public of what they're now believing. I think we also really need to challenge, right? Because those of us as guests on the call, this is knowledge that we've known and grown up knowing, right? About the violence perpetuated against us and our relatives and by the police services, and our aunties and uncles and parents have tried to teach us very specific things to not get killed by the police, and we still do that, and that's a very different narrative than what our white settler Canadians are teaching their children about the police. And again, I was thinking back to in Saskatchewan, more very prominent cases around the Starlight tours that were occurring, where the police were the perpetrators of the violence and taking Indigenous peoples out in the middle of winter out of the city and dropping them off, and some freezing to that, and some being able to walk back from that. And the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Inquiry as well, and from the TRC before that, and the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples before that, which were also brought up. All of this information is in there for all you in this region. I hear there's a lot of Buffy St. Marie fans. She's out here all the time. Those of you who listen to her song, My Country 'Tis of Thee, Thy People Are Dying, she spoke about the violence, the state violence against Indigenous peoples in that song, the stealing of the children, the violence by the police, the violence in the residential schools. You know, I think that's important to realize, that people aren't listening or are choosing not to listen and or not believe what's going on.
I think Donna wants to jump in here for a second. Donna, do you want to unmute?
Thank you. You know, things happen in our community regularly. We shared a story this morning where one of our community members, many of our community members have obtained severe trauma because of the residential school and because of the 60s scoop. And now we've got another big scoop happening, which is a millennium scoop, where our children are being taken out of their home right now from Family and Children's Services. We had an incident where we had called for some help for one of our community members who is suffering from severe mental health issues because of his trauma. And because of that, he was using some alcohol to be the Band-Aid for his well-being. And it was time for the organization to close down. We stayed open longer than normal, but he had collapsed outside on the boulevard in front of the organization, but over one house. When the police pulled up, we had given him a blanket also to cover himself because it was cold out. This just happened before COVID started. So in February of this year, when the police showed up, they didn't bother to see if he was breathing, if he was bleeding, or if he was even alive. They took the boots to him and tried to kick him to arouse him, and he was way gone in his addiction, and he was passed right out. But if he would have stayed on the street, he would have froze to death. Or he could have rolled on the road and somebody would have run him over with their vehicle. But instead, trying to arouse him, they kicked him. They pulled him up by his arms in his back area to try and get him up. And they accidentally dropped him where he went face first into the snow and into the pavement. They did it again. They picked him up, and this time his head hit the police car. When we talk about defunding the police, when we call for support services for our people who are suffering from the mental health issues from their trauma, we don't need to have guns pointed in our face. We don't need to be tased. We just need to know that we're in a safe space. We need to know that we're speaking to an individual with compassion and understanding. When somebody's standing over you in a uniform and you're at eye level with their guns and their batons and their tasers, that triggers the individual to have a fight or flight response. The defunding of the police means put the money into the services that are truly going to benefit the people who need the compassion and the respect and the healing services that those individuals need to help them move on to the next hour in their lives, the next 5 minutes of their lives. They can't do that when they're being abused even before they get into the police car. They're being abused once they're in the police car, and then when they get to the hospital, they get abused over there by the staff looking at them thinking that here comes another drunken Indian coming to the hospital, you know, wasting our time because look at them now. We don't need that anymore. We don't need that anymore. I know on a daily basis, Healing of 7 Generations has helped individuals who suffer from that extreme trauma on a day-to-day basis, every single day. And when we require services from mainstream, like the police or maybe Family and Children's Services. Family and Children's Services knows right off the hop, if they're going to go and apprehend any children in our community, they bring the police, because there again, just like residential school, the parents are fighting to keep a hold of their children, and they bring the police to stand on guard that if any one of those parents are going to fight for their children, that the police are there. And if things get out of hand, they draw their guns, they bring out their stun guns, they bring out their authoritarian voices to tell the people to back down while we steal your children. These are the things that we're talking about when you talk about defunding the police, defunding other services out there that are continuing to create the harm in the very communities that they come into. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Donna. Do you want to turn it, Ruth?
Yes.
Anything to add?
Thank you, Donna. I see in the chat that some individuals are talking about police reform. And when we say defund, we mean abolish. And I want to make that unequivocally clear. The police were created to kill us in the name of profit. The police are an invention, and all of us here, Black, Indigenous, other racialized individuals, and white people. Whiteness is an invention, and coincidentally, whiteness was invented just prior to capitalism being invented and then police being invented. They are all linked together. Before the invention of whiteness, before the invention of capitalism, and before the invention of police, all of our societies had rules, laws, practices of how to look out for one another and how to deal with individuals who transgressed norms and caused great harm. We all know how to take care of one another in a world without police. We just have to go back and find it, as well as invent new futures where we learn how to again take care of each other without police. Reform means continuing to kill us in fewer numbers. I will not have a conversation where someone tries to blend reform and abolition, because you're saying it's okay to just hurt a smaller number of us or just continue hurting us a little bit less. These institutions were created for harm. They cannot be reformed.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, Ruth. I was reading through some of the comments and noting that about this reform, and where I started, we're saying there's no equity, diversity, or inclusion policy. It does not matter if we bring in Black and Indigenous police members. This system is what drives their actions, and that system that keeps getting improved and reformed keeps, it doesn't actually decrease our deaths, it is actually increasing our deaths and our incarceration rates. Indigenous women are 35% of the incarcerated population in this country. In total, Indigenous people, all Indigenous people, we are less than 5% of the national population. And that has, on women's and our men, has increased exponentially with every improvement and reform that the police do. There was also another comment about whether or not it's the responsibility of Black and Indigenous peoples for the education. I am very grateful and appreciative of the work and the emotional labor and the trauma that my relatives have gone through, and other Indigenous relatives and ancestors, to share their truths that were documented in the TRC and also in the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls in Two-Spirit inquiry. People need to take accountability. I am not interested in sitting down to talk to somebody about residential school or the murdered and missing Indigenous women. That our people have done that work so that it is made available so other Canadians can read that and learn from that. I don't need to know, you don't need to come have a conversation with me that you've read that. I don't need to witness that you've read it. What I need you to do is to support the actions that Black and Indigenous peoples are taking up, provide us the resources, and let us get down to our work. Stop keeping us in that rut of having to always continually tell you the stories about how horrible the system has treated us and how traumatized we are from that, because we are organizing and we're taking action, and yeah, that's what we're doing.
To add a little bit to exactly what Laurier was just saying, the whole camp situation down here in Victoria Park, we actually have a non-Indigenous sort of a settler liaison that will beeline for the settler, non-Indigenous, non-Black person who is coming up to the camp, possibly going to enter without any mask, no social distancing, no really respect for the circle formation that we have. But her job is to take on that work, to help to educate the non-Indigenous settler folks approaching us before they get to us. Because I might not do it as well as someone else. They should be educating each other. Check your own people. Once you've read, tell your non-Indigenous and non-Black friends about that. It's emotionally laborious. It's traumatic to have somebody like race right up to me and, what are you guys doing here? And their tone is quite hostile. I would rather the settlers in support of us do that work for me. It's difficult to have to explain it over and over and over again, and then have them go, well, it was just the sign of the times back then. That's the way that we called everybody Indians back then. Like, it doesn't make that okay. So it's easier for us to have non-Indigenous and non-Black folks who've done the work educate their friends and their community and their families.
And very quickly to build on that, on the topic of education, I saw in the comments also that someone said, are we going towards a chaos? Defunding the police does not mean that we are sacrificing community safety. It means we are building new models, we are building new futures, and that's something that we're going to talk about more later as one of the questions to our group. But what I keep seeing is a failure of imagination and a blatant disregard for the mountain of research and writing on this subject. This is not new work. These are not new calls. They're just at the forefront right now. So I implore people to go and read. Go read Ruth Gilmore Wilson. Go read, Angela Davis. All that stuff is online. It's 2020. You can find it.
Okay, and Ciann?
Yeah, I'll just build on that. I couldn't say it better myself. Just, we are also calling for the reallocation to, services that are dealing with mental health, that are dealing with social services and health services, that are led from an anti-racist and an anti-colonial framework, and folks that are knowledgeable in these areas. That's where this money should be spent. It shouldn't be put back into training police, as if training police has ever, we've trained police. That's what we've done. We've trained them over years, and we haven't really seen the results of that. That hasn't improved, the death tolls in our communities. And so there's a lot to be said. There's actually a really interesting story that comes out of the United States, where one of the actual trainers of the police also was a part of the protests that erupted after George Floyd's murder, and he was actually shot at by police. So just to fully bring that in circles, training means putting more resources into the very systems that have proven to not work for our communities. So that's not what we are asking for. We are certainly asking for the reallocation of these resources to services, to people who are professionals and trained professionals at that. To carry out all of the social and health services that actually do serve our communities, and do deal with upstream factors that do cause or lead to folks being in dire situations that may lead them to committing petty crimes, for example, or that nature of things. So really dealing with the sort of sources of some of the challenges in our communities is where we're looking at, and re-envisioning what community accountability looks like, and these things that you know that Fitsum has alluded to, I think are some of the calls or parts of this larger conversation about reallocation of resources to communities that we are talking about. I also wanted to build on what Laurier was talking about earlier in terms of not wanting to teach. We are exhausted, we are tired, we're also fighting for our own survival and that of our own communities, and hell, I don't have time to teach you when I'm fighting for my own survival and that of my community. Sorry, that's not what we're here for. I also think it's a really interesting form of trauma porn that white folks get to indulge in when we do that, when we unpack you know, these traumas in our lives, these experiences in our lives that are really you know, we're putting them out there, we're usurping them, and there's no, what do we do with that? It's great for you, you get to listen and go home and feel great about yourself, but you know, that leaves a lot of scars for us, and so I'm not really you know, encouraging of that, and I'm quite hesitant of it in terms of its utility. We've told countless narratives, countless you know, given countless examples of evidence, and evidence, you know, we're always asked for more and more evidence, and that's another piece of the larger white supremacist sort of structure, always asked to prove and provide evidence, and no matter how many stories, how many testimonies, how much evidence we provide, we're still asked for more, and even then nothing's actually changed or done. And so there is a point at which folks are asking for change. We're done with the bullshit. Let's look at action.
We also need the time to take on, like, you know, Amy and I know we've had conversations about this, but the amount of time that we're investing to try and relearn what was stolen from us means we need to engage with our elders to do that, our old ones, our aunties, our uncles. And at the same time, you know, I work as director of the Indigenous Student Center at the university, and the students are coming in our door and they're needing us to help them on their journey. And so if I spend all my time, if Amy and I spend, and Donna spend all our time doing education over and over of the same thing to settler Canadians, then we continue to get further and further away from our own learning and our own health and well-being. And again, you know, many Indigenous peoples have put that down. There is, you know, 30 years ago, it was challenging to find Indigenous authored stories and scholarship about our experiences. That is the case no more. There are lists all over out there, and same, you know, in the Black community, and then the crossover between Black and Indigenous in Canada, and like, it's amazing. So yeah, like, get that.
Thanks, Laurier. And for those of you who've been following along in the chat, there have been a ton of great resources put down here. Some of our panelists have jumped in, other people have shared them. I encourage you to take a look, but also the Community Foundation will be pulling them all together and sharing them as well for you. But like everyone has said, this is our responsibility to be doing that, and a ton of information has been shared with you today. So hopefully you're going to take the time to really learn and take that responsibility for yourself. I'm going to move on to the next question now. How have you built Indigenous and Black solidarity within and between your communities, and how has this been transformative for your mobilizing? We'll start this off with Fitsum.
Yes, and I'm seeing how much time we have left, so I'm going to try and keep it brief and to the point to allow other panelists to jump in. But the lingering effects of colonialism and the racist logic of enslavement have made it so that it has been difficult to connect, you know, within and across our communities. Not impossible, because we find a way to resist and connect despite that, but it has been difficult. But, you know, these are complex issues that require, you know, solidarity is a complex thing. And I find that art offers a fantastic way for solidarity between and across Indigenous and Black people. And that's what I've done in my own work with Textile magazine, where, you know, I've partnered with Indigenous artists to deliver art programming to Indigenous and Black youth in our region. And through that art, answer some tough questions and you know, come to a place of understanding where we can connect on these issues, but also communicate what it means, what Black and Indigenous solidarity means to us, to the wider community, and why it's important. So last year we did a mural downtown Kitchener where Indigenous youth answer the question, how do you want settlers to acknowledge the land, as opposed to doing a land acknowledgement mural? That's not for Indigenous people to do. How the land needs to be acknowledged is something that each settler has to sit with and figure out for themselves. And so that was a great piece. We're undergoing a few other projects, but you know, when it comes to mobilizing, I find that art has been an amazing way to do that, and also an area that's been severely underfunded. I can say, you know, from my own experience, that it's been incredibly difficult to find funding to support art for Black and Indigenous solidarity. And it's really, really disheartening to hear people give lip service but not funds.
Ciann?
I'll just vibe off of that in terms of arts-based work. So a lot of my work ends up being community and arts-based research. Big surprises there in terms of my work with Indigenous and Black and racialized communities. And one of the projects that I'm super proud to have been a part of and have partnered with some amazing folks in doing is the Proclaiming Our Roots project, which was an arts-based digital media project that really focused on centering the lives, realities, and histories of Indigenous Black people in Canada, and sort of writing those stories into being in the Canadian consciousness, because not a lot of people understand the rich wealth of history and connections between Indigenous and Black people throughout Canada's history, that communities have been created, movements have been created across the Americas and across Turtle Islands, everything from the Haitian Revolution to the Seminole Wars of the 1860s to you name it. There have been some really pivotal social movements that have been leveraged on the backs of Indigenous and Black people and mixed Indigenous Black people on Turtle Island. So I just want to sort of highlight that, shout out, and sort of like, that work that I've been, again, so privileged to be a part of, and the stories that I've been so, again, honored to be able to facilitate and sharing with the world in terms of history in Canada, just to, again, tie those connections of arts-based work and Indigenous and Black solidarity in Canada.
Okay, we have, thank you. We are going to end up going over, but I think this is a really important conversation. So we're going to keep going, but figure we'll probably be about 10 minutes over, just letting all of our viewers know if you do have to go to something else, this is being recorded, it will be shared, and the resources will be shared. But I don't want to cut this conversation off because it's such an important one. So for the final conversation, this talks about where we're going to go. And so where do we go from here as it pertains to Black and Indigenous futures? And what do we envision for our communities, and how do we get there? Amy, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, thank you. This was the occupation here at Victoria Park. This is what my co-founder and partner are envisioning. Land-based, land back, first off, but land-based education for urban Indigenous, Black community members as well. We're expanding sort of our scope into elders from everywhere coming in to do some virtual teaching if that's how we're going to do things, Zoom these days. But in particular, what I see for the future is exactly what's only been happening here in the last 4 days. We've had youth come out who've been so disconnected from their communities. One youth, visibly Indigenous, said, "No, I'm white," and it actually broke my heart. Like, it broke my heart. We had a ceremony with some youth. We birthed a drum. We've had firekeeping around our sacred fire here. Just, this is exactly why we are doing these things. I had a wonderful conversation with another youth who stopped by, who had, sort of lost track of their teachings, and they're coming every day now. These are the kinds of things that we need. Defunding the police, all the other services will impact all of those things: the mental health, the self-esteem, the identity, the reconnection to the land. Having spaces partnered with us from community organizations, I'm just going to say it, RARE and the community gardens, and have that clawed back from us after the youth and the Indigenous community members do the work to feed our community. we're at the whim of the landowners. We're at the whim of the colonial governments. I think Donna mentioned in the post earlier, you know, when we want to use the pavilion here in Victoria Park for our solstice and equinox feasts, for National Indigenous People Day, for Multicultural Festival. Let's see, we have to, you know, get it in advance, book it in advance, pay. We pay $500 for the pavilion for an afternoon, which is not staffed. There's no cleanup. They simply unlock the door. We bring our own food. We do everything ourselves. But for $500 for a few hours, twice a year, National Indigenous People Day, we maybe get a piece of the island. There's a number of other days. You know, it's Father's Day as well. Other groups get their own space. We have to book in advance. Multicultural Festival, we have to pay for a booth. We usually get one near the back of the park, near the religious booths. And everyone else gets to celebrate the multicultural community here in Kitchener-Waterloo, but not ours. We have no platform. As a matter of fact, when we had what we thought was the center under the clock tower space for a drum circle, we didn't. They meant near the back of the park. So that's particularly what we see here in this space, being such a historically significant space, to reclaim that, to allow the youth a space that will not be clawed back, that we don't have to pay for. These are our lands. And we could bury, you know, everyone in some bureaucracy. There are Supreme Court decisions that allow us to exercise our treaty rights. We have absolutely every right to do so. And we are simply doing that here. And I'll speak to a couple other things I've seen in the chat there. I know Laurie pointed out the Neil Stonechild, the Starlight Tours. My brother was taken on a Starlight Tour. That's not something that happened years and years and years and years ago. He made it back to town before he froze to death. That's a very current reality. Unfortunately, we had an incident here where somebody had to be taken to the hospital in an ambulance. And the dispatch, obviously, you know, she's an Indigenous woman. She was picked up in Victoria Park. And it went horribly wrong from there. This woman does not use drugs or alcohol, would never. And it was immediately assumed that she had passed out, she had OD'd, something along those lines. And the treatment she received at St. Mary's Hospital was just abominable. She was more traumatized by that, I think, than the incident itself. It just goes to show that the disparities in these systems that we have, we can see them. They are clearly affecting us. And I think that the resources we put into policing should be put into the systems that we had prior that worked for all of us. My daughter has not stopped powwow dancing, drumming, singing. She has been participating in every ceremony. She's sleeping like a baby in the teepee. I have lost weight, I'm tanned. This is what we need to be doing. This is 100% what I envision the future to be. Land back, and not just symbolically, but I'm not comfortable with, oh, you can build a sweat lodge on the edge of my farm, and you know, maybe a year from now I might sell it and I might change my mind, or maybe I'll start charging rent. And we're at the whim of landholders. And we're the original caretakers of this space. I do unfortunately have to leave you at that. We do have some more folks joining us. I would invite you all to come down and join us. We'll be drumming later. We'll be here as long as we can be, as long as it takes. And unfortunately, with the radio silence from the city, we're going to stretch it out as long as we can. And we're going to continue to build and continue to bring in more people, more elders, and then in solidarity with our Black community members as well, offering them this space, all of our resources, supplies, anything we need, so that we can begin teaching the youth everything that we've lost. And I'm gonna go. I have to leave it at that. We're about to have dinner. We're about to have a feast. So I do have to leave it at that, but I will check out the recording afterwards, and you know, follow our page, follow the hashtag land back, and I do appreciate being asked to contribute to this conversation. I know the wind is, you probably can't even hear me very well, but I'm gonna take my leave of you, and I so appreciate this. Nyawa, Keenan Iskomatin. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Amy.
Donna.
While Amy goes off, I'll turn it over to Ruth.
Something that I think is important to think about is I want to ask people what they think about when they think about Indigenous futures. And I want to ask them what they think about when they think about Black futures. In the popular imagination, there are no Black and Indigenous people in the future. Okay? Sci-fi, fiction, our entertainment doesn't imagine a future that is Indigenous, that is brown and Black. We don't exist in that future. I think that says something about capitalism and resource extraction and environmental destruction and environmental racism. Okay. If I think about a Black and Indigenous future, I think about reclaiming, much like you said, Laurie, going back to reclaim knowledge that has been stolen through the transatlantic slave trade, through colonialism and through settler colonialism. Okay. Histories of cooperation that have been erased as well, as spoken to by you, Ciann. So I think that it's really important, this question about futures, because if it talks about building a better way. Again, I go back to what I said before, that all of us have ways of living with each other, living on land that is not extractive, and cooperating with each other to build safety and make sure there is enough for all. And we have to remember that. That is thinking back to before colonization and settler colonialism happened, and that is thinking back to before whiteness was invented. We can take all of that knowledge. We don't only have to look back, but we can also then think forward into building new systems, new functional systems that work for all of us. Okay? The here and now is a trap. The focus on capitalism, the way that we are forced to work under capitalism, limits our imagination. It causes that failure of the imagination that you mentioned, Fitsum. In this time, because of the way people have been forced to slow down because of COVID, it's a lens. It allows us to see all the inequality that happens around us in even more of a sharper relief and highlight. And it also has given those of us who have the luxury of working from home, who aren't essential workers, who are put at risk by COVID, to think deeply about how we want to live. So it's given those of us who have privilege the luxury of time to think deeply in the ways we can't in the capitalist grind. And so we have a real opportunity here, those of us with privilege, to think about how we live with those who have very little privilege and build a better future for all of us, with leadership from those who are most affected by everything that's going on right now. And I'm going to leave it at that.
Thanks, Ruth.
You know, the reserve system was not intended to be here today. It was not intended to exist, right? Because Indigenous peoples, like we said, like we were not intended to still be here. There was no future Canada. There was no Canada 2020 that had Indigenous peoples in it. And, and so, when I hear, others complain about, why don't they just, come off the reserves, or there's floods or all these other things that are occurring and stuff. We got to remember that the settlement project actually did not imagine us to even exist. So that should have never happened. When the treaties were made, there was no Indigenous future. So that was never meant to have to uphold those agreements. But obviously that isn't the case, right? I would also add, though, like, people need to take on so much more accountability. Like I said, if you have not at least read the summary report of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous and Women and Girls in Two-Spirit Inquiry, then you're not at all ready to have a conversation with me. I wasn't born, first of all, knowing, because of the sanitization of the education system, wasn't born knowing who I was. So I had to learn, first of all, our mainstream education system and how Canada is set up and functions. I also took on all this learning. I actually took an entire 4-year break specifically between 2 of my undergrads, because I did 2 undergrads because I didn't think Indigenous peoples went to graduate school. So I have 2 undergrads, my master's, and I'm now on my PhD. but I took a 4-year break to go learn with elders in my community intentionally. And then also because of the sanitization of Black history and contemporary realities in our education system, I am also putting in time to bring myself up to speed, because I need to know that this is part of what brings us collectively to where we are today. And I don't see as many settler Canadians, intergenerational settler Canadians, taking on and doing that work. So they aren't ready mostly to come to the table to have conversations with us to take action. In the meantime, we're doing that work. I see that in conversation with my peers here on the call, and I'm not from this territory, so I also have additional work of learning about the Haldimand Tract and the territory that I'm in. I'm from Treaty 6, Northern Saskatchewan, very different. And we're like putting in that time and effort. It's not a project. It's really, thinking about the future, and actually, a future that we are able to thrive in, not just still try to survive, or worse yet, not exist in.
Donna, did you have something you wanted to add in?
Yes, I did. I think for me, for us to move forward, for things to happen in a very positive way, the individuals that we need to have a conversation with need to be the decision makers. They need to be at the table, and they need to not provide us with lip service. They need to do true action and say, if this is what's going to happen in our brothers and sisters who are Black, in their community, in the Native community, we need to see the action happening, not waiting 1 year, 5 years, 10 years down the line before we see anything positive happening in our community. We have been conversing with many different decision makers in our communities for 20 years, and during that time, nothing has happened. In this region of Waterloo, we have to make change, not only us, but the broader community, the mainstream community that we call it, because it has been us and them for years and years and years, more years than I can think of, way before we had cities the way that we do now. Before, when the visitors first came, that's when colonialism first started. We need to get back to a better place where it's not us and them. We need to speak for ourselves. We don't need non-Indigenous, non-Black people to speak on our behalf. We can speak on our own behalf. We have shared over and over what our needs are. And I think it's been said previous that don't come to us and ask us for where do we start, what are your needs are. All of them, all those decision makers already know that, all the way to the top. They already know what the needs are. We need to start seeing some action, and we need to start throwing bias and racism out the window. It's not about that. It's not about who's got and who's not. The very, very common statement about when the Indigenous community applies for anything, or the Indigenous people are out in the community, oh, them Indians, they get everything for free. We certainly do not get anything for free. We definitely do not. I would like to leave that with everybody to think with. Before you come to us and ask us how you can help, come to us with a solution already and say, this is what we want to do for you. What do you think about it? And we can go from there. Thank you for inviting me to this platform today. Thank you for listening to my voice. Ona Gawahi, talk to you soon. Ona.
Thank you, Donna, for your final comments there. I think Ciann had something she wanted to add before we signed off.
Yeah, just to build on something that Donna and Ruth have said, we put our cards on the table. We've made our demands. The question now is, are you willing to part with white privilege? Are you willing to part with white settlerism and white supremacy in terms of honoring those asks? And yes, and that is the question for me on the table, and that is what I'll leave the audience with.
I want to address one more question that I see just popped up about, can the city provide the Park Pavilion to Indigenous, Black, or minority groups as a year-round education center or museum? That is not what we're asking for here. The land or the education camp that Amy is running and the work that we're doing is for us. There's plenty of resources out there for others to learn about us and to learn about the history of colonization, violent colonization has had on Indigenous and Black people in this country. So that's your work. This is our work, and we're going ahead to do our work.
We're almost 15 minutes over, but I wanted to see if anyone had any final comment they wanted to say. I guess Fitsum and Ruth, is there anything you wanted to add? If not, we'll turn it over to Elizabeth.
Nothing other than I'm deeply honored and excited that these are the kinds of conversations that are being centered. I get to talk in conversation with my Indigenous siblings, and I get to talk with my mentors and talk about things that really matter. Frankly, things that have not been given center stage in our region. So we're on the cusp of change, but we need the political will to really see that through.
What I want to touch on in saying, my goodbyes for this conversation as it comes to a close is we aren't envisioning our futures as only intertwined. We're thinking about, as we walk in parallel beside each other, we're thinking about where we diverge and where we come together, right? We aren't coming up with this off the cuff. We are tying back into the deep knowledge that exists within our communities. We are both on paths of reclaiming because of all of the intentional disruption done by white supremacy that separates us from ourselves, from our wealth and wells of knowledge. And we have work to do together and apart. And we are not interested in a gaze upon that work that is voyeuristic or looking to appropriate or quite literally profit off of that knowledge. Because of under capitalism, everything is monetized, and people take our knowledge and quite literally turn it into profit. That's not what we're here for. I think that the only other thing I want to say is that I put something in the chat about if you have done your work and you want to envision futures, you are welcome to envision futures with us if you have done your work. Outside of that, I will say my goodbye by saying walk good, which has meaning.
Thank you so much, Ruth, Fitsum, Donna, Ciann, Laurier, and to Andrea for hosting this conversation. I know that I mentioned this is the first in a series of these conversations. I really hope that when we come back next time, we can share the actions that have occurred. I think you've provided us so many resources, food for thought, situations that have occurred that, quite frankly, I know I didn't know all about all of them. And so I really, really just want to thank you so much for joining us.